Today we're going to be covering some of the sort of preliminary setup to get ready for painting and what that looks like essentially on a daily basis. And then we're going to be creating a value scale. And the whole purpose of the value scale is to get familiarized with kind of segmenting these mixtures into particular values and what that might look like for the sake of painting, how you can apply this in a practical setting and use this to make the painting process so much easier for you. Here's the first thing to look at. I've got my jars of linseed oil here. So as I told you, this is really all that I do for taking care of my brushes. I just put these brushes down in my jar, and you can see they're dripping with oil. And so I keep this linseed oil filled up enough that it's going to keep those brushes soaked. And then when I'm ready to paint, when I need to get ready for something like doing this value scale painting, then I can just pull out these brushes, wipe off some of that excess, and I'll even just set them down right here. And so that way, every single day when I'm painting, these are going to be fresh and ready, and I've got them separated into my value mixtures usually as well. And then I don't have to do much work as far as getting set up or taking things down on a daily basis. I'm pretty much just ready to go. So while I'm painting, I'll just leave these sitting here if I'm not actively using it, and I'll have my palette knife handy as well. And you notice I've got this rag here, so the rag is to just take up some of that excess paint, and it's going to help if I ever need to just wipe off excess. If I have too much paint on my brush, I've got this rag nice and handy here. It's important if your rag starts to get really filled up, if it's covered in oil, all you have to do is just take this one away, replace it with a new one. But what you do with that rag is important. You don't want it to be balled up and just thrown on the ground or something like that. It's important you keep it spread out like this and put it in an area where it can dry safely. The issue, if you ball it up, it can actually spontaneously combust and start a fire. I just set them on top of an easel, on top of a stand, on top of a table, whatever the case may be, and just leave it spread out so that it's not of any risk. If you're curious about my painting setup, here's what this looks like. So I've got my easel set up. You can see I've got the palette attached there. My normal palette is actually this table stand with a palette attached as a board, so it's just a nice big open space, and it's on that stand so I can put it right up next to my painting. It's very sturdy, very maneuverable. I can change it to different heights, different angles, and it's super easy to work with, so I highly recommend that. I just do these kind of vertical palettes or something easier to capture on camera when I'm doing these demonstrations. But normally when I'm using a palette, it's going to be this tripod sort of stand, and that's super convenient. The other thing you'll notice is that I've got this light directly to the side of my painting, and I've got the table right here handy for access. I've got that on my right side, of course, because I'm right-handed, and then I can get easy reach for everything that I might need within the painting process. If I have extra brushes, I can set them down on the table. I can have my palette knife on the table. Any tools I might need, an extra rag, whatever the case may be, I'm going to have that within arm's reach, so I'm not messing around trying to go find something while I'm in the middle of the painting process. The other thing I'll point out is that this really does not take up a lot of space. With even a very small amount of space, you can do a lot, and you just need room to have really your easel, a light, and a little bit of space to walk back and forth, but it doesn't take so much. So that's a misconception about painting a lot of times, is that you need to have some grand studio and a lot of space. And I can promise you, I've painted in tiny spaces for most of the time that I've been painting. I've never had such a big studio until quite recently, and it gets the job done. So whatever is necessary, whatever it takes to just give yourself a consistent setup, I think is the most important, and then you can worry about making upgrades or trying to expand your space as you go. Just having a consistent and reliable space, I would say, is more important than the amount of space. So if you can just have a decent setup and keep it there, that's going to be critical. So that way you're not trying to set up or take things down repeatedly. The other thing I'll show you here is my setup with the still life. So you can see I've got my light to the left here above my still life and angled down in that beautiful Rembrandt lighting, and this is just over the shoulder of my easel. My palette here you can see is even in the frame, and that way when I'm looking at this, I'm just looking straight to the side of my palette or my painting, and I'm not having to move around a lot or do a lot to see the still life or the subject that I've got set up. If I were to have a live model, guess what? That's where the live model would be. And you can see that already. I've got that cast set up there. But notice that it's not very complicated. I've just got a light, a little bit of space here so I can see what I'm looking at. And this table could be brought significantly closer as well. So it's not necessary to even have this much space, especially if you're just working on a still life or something very simple like this. For those of you who might be curious, this is what linen looks like. And this is a particularly rough linen, which I personally love because I'm going to put my oil ground on top of that. The oil ground is going to compensate a little bit to smooth it out. And then you're left with a beautiful texture on that surface, which I think is critical for this lively quality and the rough and loose effect that you find with late Rembrandt, for example. But this is what it looks like. So this is a sized linen. This is just a scrap from one of my larger canvases, and I'm going to use this for the demonstration. If I'm actually working on a serious painting, then I'll have the oil ground preparation on there as well. Back to the setup and preparation, I wanted to show you what this really looks like in a practical sense each day. I mean, really all I'm doing is I'm just taking these brushes out. So you saw they're in here. I can pull off any excess oil inside that jar to just not waste it. And then if I still have something on my brush, I just wipe these brushes off on the rag. Occasionally replace that rag so that it's not getting overfilled with oil. Then I've got my palette knife handy, so this is going to be always within reach. I'll have some sandpaper within reach, and this palette knife is not only useful for mixing paint, but also for some of the painting process, which we'll get into later in this course. The other thing you'll notice I have here is this magic mud jar. So many have been curious about that. That is solvent, and I keep this closed. It's sealed, so I'm not getting that solvent evaporating. But I've got some old paint in there, and it creates this beautiful muddy gray sort of mixture with my solvent and old paint. So that's all that is, if you were curious, but that's where I have solvent. So if I need solvent, maybe if I'm painting in the first layer, or if I need to just wipe out some brushes or do something particular that requires that solvent, I've got it handy. Then, once the painting day is finished, what I'll do is I'll take my brushes, I'll drop them back down into this jar, and I'll use my palette knife to scrape down my palette. So that's very important to remember. You want to clean off that palette to not let it get too much crusty, crumbly stuff built up on it, and to give yourself a good surface to work with. And then I'll clean this off, I'll wipe it off on here, use my rag like this to take off any extra paint that might be left on that palette knife, and then I'm good to go. So that's it. That's really all it takes. I'll have my light set up, so everything ideally should be set up and ready for painting each day. That way I don't have to do any preparation work. I just come into the studio and I'm ready to start painting. And let me tell you, that makes a world of difference when it comes to motivation and friction. It makes it so much easier to just keep going and to consistently work and to paint every single day without fail, because it's so easy to get started. So I will talk about this palette. This is one of my homemade palettes, the DIY. If you saw that video, or if you haven't seen it, you can go watch it. This is fantastic because it's lightweight, it's easy to work with, and if I were to use this as a standing palette, it just takes a lot of pressure off. So you're able to move around, it's very light, and then you can always just get rid of it if you need to. So there's no sweat, no stress about if I do get some paint dried on here, it's not really a big deal. I can always just make myself a new one, or I have many of these on hand that are just ready to use. Today we're going to be painting with black and white. So I've got my titanium white and my Mars black here, and these are both from Old Holland. It's important that these are the types of colors you are using. Even if you may be using that sort of cheaper option, you still want to make sure it's titanium white and Mars black. As we go through the process and we get further into the Apelles palette, that will become increasingly important. And once you introduce this sort of combination of warm and cool colors, then it is critical. At this point, it's not as big of a deal, but it will still be important if you're trying to imitate and to do the same thing as me, because there's going to be a certain appearance of the color when it comes to just mixing the value scale. And then on top of that, what I would say is even more important is once we start putting this on the surface, the way that the paint is going to interact, the way that it's going to dry, the way that it picks up, goes on the canvas, and then settles, and the way that it's going to layer through the process. All of these things are going to be very different if you have a low quality paint. With that, we're going to get started. I'm going to start mixing my value scale here, and I would encourage you to follow along. This may take a bit of time, so I will also stress that you should be very patient with this process, especially if this is your first time trying to do this kind of thing, because it can be kind of stressful or kind of frustrating if you've never worked with oil paint before. It is a very unique experience, but I'll do my best here to give you some warnings and try to walk you through this in a way that is nice and calm, and hopefully get you started without these frustrating issues that can come with the medium. This is a pretty hefty amount of paint, it seems like, but in order to make sure we get some solid mixtures here and to cover up this canvas, then I want to make sure I have enough. And I will encourage you to also be just kind of open to this as part of the learning process. So, don't feel like you're wasting paint here. This is a very important part of the process, and it's easier to do it if you have enough paint. If you're sitting here trying to scrape into, just barely anything, like if you're trying to scrape into this right here and you're pulling up chips of your palette trying to get this little tiny amount of paint, I mean, that's no fun at all. So give yourself a sufficient amount of paint. If you need to, you can always replace it, but it's very good practice. A tip I'll point out here, as I'm already halfway through the process or more, you want to have a small enough space that it's easy to fill in the space. So for you guys, if you are doing this, I might cut this down to size like 1/3 if I were you, because otherwise you're just using a lot of paint and it takes a lot to fill it in. It's fine for me because I'm doing this demonstration. I should have maybe had bigger brushes, but that's kind of, I guess, what I'm talking about here. What I'm thinking about is the proportion of your brush to the canvas and the space that you're filling in. Ideally you want to be able to fill in kind of, I'd say at least half the space with a single mark. That would be a good size to work on here. So depending on the size of your brushes, I guess that would impact the size of the canvas that you could work on here. And, consequently, if you're using a significantly smaller amount of space compared to what I'm doing here, you'd use significantly less paint as well. So that's just a little tip for you. I'm not saying you should mix a tiny amount of paint. You should mix a decent amount so that way you're getting the practice. But when it comes to actually filling in the space, it does require a lot of paint to fill in this amount of canvas. If you're unfamiliar with oil paint, you'll notice it's pretty thick, and you see how it kind of just sits on the surface. So even though I've got this vertical, nothing's running down. It's not going to run away from you. It's very comfortable here. This will be my one value, my absolute lightest value. And something tricky here, once you start mixing, you need to be aware that these are not equal, okay? So theoretically, like if we're on a computer, let's say, and we wanted to just mix out the perfect value scale or have the sort of perfect gradation, we'd say, okay, we're just going to do 10% and then 20, 30, 40, right? We're going to like segment it, and we're going to try to mix these and just use the perfect amount. So right once we're in the middle, if we want the perfect mid-tone, it's going to be 50-50, right? But that's not how it works in oil painting. These do not have the same strength. So most of the time, there's going to be a sort of imbalance. And we'll get into this once we start working with colors as well. But you want to start out kind of subtle and see how it works. So you'll notice I'm just pulling some of this white around, just seeing how this is going to move on the palette. And I'm also trying to space it out a little bit. But I only need a small amount of black. So you'll notice I'm even just kind of scratching. You hear that? And look at this tiny little bead that I have on here. And you're going to see even that little amount. Look at how much it's going to change this paint. So this is why you really don't need a lot of that black when we first start mixing here. So you see that. And that's what I'm talking about with the imbalance. So it's only going to take a tiny amount, and that already, I would say that's closer to our 4 value here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull this down. We're going to say this is our 4 value. Then I'm going to go back. I'm going to take some more white. I'll put this down here. And I'm going to just use some of this paint that's on my knife. And I'm going to mix up now my 3 value. So this is the experimental process that you're going to find is very necessary in painting. You're almost never going to be getting exactly what you want on the first try. I would say it never happens. Never happens. Instead, you have to work into it and try to observe what's happening, take note of the change, and then adjust accordingly. And so I notice, okay, this is darker than what I want it to be up here, so I have to pull it down and get something a little bit lighter up here. And now I would say this one is just a little bit too light maybe for that 3 value. Or it might be just right. It's pretty close. So now I need just a tiny, tiny bit of black to go in there. And I can take this and just mix it in and make a very subtle change. The other thing which you can do, the other sort of cheat code here, what you can do is you can take a little bit of this and then we can pull this into our next value. And so if you just want to make a subtle change, that's a much easier way to take a gradual step rather than trying to add black to such a light color. So we don't have to jump all the way up and use our 10 value, our black, to try and mix that 2 value. Instead, it makes more sense, okay, let's pull a little bit of that 3 and let's pull that up there, and that way we're making more gradual changes. And that's how I would actually approach painting. I would not use that black. And this is kind of one of the tricks of mixing the palette, is that you want to start with something very subtle and then gradually work your way towards something more exaggerated. So I'll show you again. What I can do is I can pull some of this white down my palette, and now I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to start with my black, and I'm going to pull this down here. And so you could say right here, let's get our 9 value. So this should barely be lighter than our black. Basically, I just took this black with a tiny amount of white. And so now this is, I mean, as close as you can get, really. It might even be just a little bit too dark. So I can scrape just a little bit of this white and pull that in there. Now I can use this to grade up and to subtly move up my sort of value ladder here. And I can now say, okay, this is going to be my 7, and we'll put a little bit of that further up and just keep dragging it. And we'll say this is the 6 right here. And this is going to be our 5. And so I'm still using the same mixture essentially. I'm just pulling it up the palette. And now I can start to fine tune some of these if I need to make changes. Like these two are really close, whereas these are further apart. So now maybe I want to come back down. I want to get some more of this type of value and pull this up. So I can add just a little bit right here to make the 7 value a little bit darker. Maybe go a little bit darker still. And then I can use some of that and go further up, and now we've got our 6 value here. Or excuse me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here's 5. So our 5 value should be like this. That's pretty accurate based on this little piece of paper that I have. Then the 6, and that looks pretty accurate too. 7. Okay, so this will be our 8. Okay, hopefully you can see this a little bit better. I'll come all the way down here, and I'll say, okay, there's my 10, and here's my 8, 9. So let's blend together the 9 and the 8. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this is a pretty good starting point, I'd have to say. Let's take just a little bit more white right in here. I realize I might have been going a little bit quickly here, so I'll try to point out a couple of tips. Number one, notice that I was starting at something very extreme and then subtly working towards the middle. So either starting with that white or starting with that black and then working towards the middle. I'm not going to try to jump into the midtones and then grade each way, or try to, jump somewhere super specific. I'm going to first try to give myself a little bit of a basis, and then I'll start to work out from there. And the other thing is that I will start on one side and work that out and then go to the other side, but I started on the light side, and I think that's the route I would suggest, because you can more easily go darker. As you saw, the black has a sort of stronger power when it comes to these mixtures, and that way I'm not taking this dark mixture and trying to bring that up here now. So you see my palette knife is dirty. If I need to, I can clean this off. One thing I like to do to not waste paint is to just wipe some of this off right here. That way if I want to use that, I can. Then I also don't have to clean so much off my palette knife, so I can take my rag and just wipe this off. Now I've got a clean knife, and I didn't have to fill up my rag with a bunch of wet paint. Okay, so something I'm noticing now is that I think there is a little bit more I could do in this light side. A little bit more maybe. I do like these overall, but I think these three are too similar, whereas there's a greater step once we go further down and we're into, let's say, like going from 5 to 6 to 7, there's a greater separation there. So I'm going to take just a little bit of what I just had there on that knife, and notice I'm just scratching. So this is kind of a way, if you need to pick up a very small amount of paint off your palette, you can scratch into something like that. If you want to pick up a larger amount, then you want to use the edge and really scrape it down like this. And then you'll pick up all that paint. So that's just a little tip for you when it comes to the mixing. And the same goes if you're going to actually, let's say, mix some paint. You want to make sure you're scraping all the way down into the palette. So I'm picking up all of this paint. It's all on my knife now. That way, once I mix it, it's going to blend all the way through. And that way I'm not dealing with something left behind. So we'll do the same thing right here. And let's just make this one a little bit darker first. So we go a little bit darker here. And then we'll pull that up. Okay. The other thing is that if you want to make these kind of distinct separations, you should pull all the way down and create a segment like this. So use the flat edge to create that segment. But then also be aware that it's going to require that you have a little bit of contrast there. This is the kind of difficult part with this whole thing, is to actually create these sort of separations, and that's why I recommend, keep this sort of value scale handy. Maybe we could even pull this out and, compare side by side here. So this way I get a better idea, okay, where are my values lining up? Where am I having some issues maybe? What do I need to do in order to make sure I'm actually creating this sort of range? And so I would say, let's see if this one can go just a hair lighter right here. And into my 9. And then we're gonna pull the 10 down here. The 10 is not really all that practical per se. It's just black, so not a big deal. But I'm going to repeatedly compare. I'm gonna see, okay, how is this lining up? Am I creating some kind of separation between these values, or these, distinct and separate values? I can also test, I can take a little bit of this paint and put it onto the value scale, even though, it's not going to be perfect. Hopefully I can get you some kind of guide or reference that will be more accurate according to this paint. But I want to urge this idea that it's not going to be super easy as far as, just immediately matching what you're looking for. It's going to require a little bit of back and forth. It's going to require some testing. You're going to have to try out some various values and then, replace them or adjust accordingly. So I think these right here could use just a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to pull a little bit more white right here. Let's see what that looks like. I think that's better now. A very serious tip for you here is that you should be patient. You should be calm and just, take the process as it comes to you, and don't be worried if things don't go very smoothly. That's very normal. I really struggled with this in the beginning when I first started painting. So it's totally normal. A big part of the process here is that you just have to get used to how to actually work with these tools. It might be your first time mixing oil paint, or maybe trying to use a palette knife to mix this stuff up. And there's a lot of small nuances that come with that. My biggest tip is going to be to try to give yourself some clean kind of separations here. And even if you have to, repeatedly come back to each individual mixture, that's okay. That's part of the learning process here, is figuring out how do you work with the paint, how do you create these. And if you're able to do this, if you're able to create these mixtures, I can tell you it's going to make the painting process so much easier. It's insane. It's going to make it way, way easier if you just have these available. And you're going to find that out very quickly, because once we get into some of these demonstrations, you're going to need to have these pre-mixed. And it's not anything trivial here. I mean, this is a large part of the process. This is like more than half of the process, frankly, is just how do you get these mixtures? How do you kind of separate and give yourself these values to work with? So it's not as if, you know, this is something separate from painting, or like you wish you could be painting right now, but darn it, we have to do these silly value scales. No, this is painting. This is a very important part of the process. So take your time to create these values. I will be waiting for you. You know, feel free to pause the video and take your sweet time. This is nothing that needs to happen in an instant. It's not any rush. But once you are ready and you've mixed up and you feel like you have some solid values, then and only then we're going to continue, and you can join me here. We're going to do the actual value scale. I've drawn these lines on here. If you'd like to be more meticulous, feel free to make this cleaner, maybe make them more even, and I'll just start painting these and show you some of the key ideas that you need to understand once you start painting. I'll show you the brushes really quick. As I said, you know, I will take them out of the oil, and I won't necessarily wipe them off before I start painting, because I might decide, yeah, I want a little bit of oil on my brush. And that will be the case with these darker mixtures. I'm going to use my darker brush. So that's this one right here. I'm going to make sure it's not too filled with paint. So I can see that it's got a little bit of a tone to it, and that's okay. But I don't want it to have, you know, globs of paint stuck in my bristles. And then I'm just going to dip a little bit of oil, and I'm going to actually wipe it on the edge. So you see how some of that's falling off? And what that does is it just fills these bristles with oil. So in the darker side in particular, you're going to want thinner paint, and generally that's going to be where you might use more of your medium. For this demonstration, I'm just going to use oil, so I'm not using solvent. But typically, if I'm painting on real painting, you know, a serious painting, then I'm actually going to use solvent in the first layer. So that would be the only difference here. If this is the first layer of a real painting, I'm going to use solvent. For the sake of the demonstration, I'm just going to use oil, so that way I'm not dealing with the solvent, and I'm not going to be building any layers or doing anything with this anyway, so I don't think it's necessary. Okay, so here's that same brush, and you're going to notice if I press this into the palette, you see how that's got some oil coming out of it? What I can do is I can just clean it out just a little bit, and now I've got a little bit of oil here if I want it. Otherwise I can just start pulling into this black, and I can take a little bit more if I need it. And notice what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fill up my brush, and I'm going to make sure when I'm actually pulling this, I'm getting myself a serious mixture. So what I want to make sure is just that as I'm pulling this on my palette, it actually is black. I'm not dealing with that color anymore. I've actually got some more black. The other thing is that I don't want this to be super thick. So that's why I didn't, you know, scoop up a large amount of paint. I'm kind of keeping it nice and thin here. So this is lesson number 1 when it comes to your brush work and the layering process, as well as this kind of light and shadow painting process. The difference in the dark versus the light is that you want to have thinner paint in your darker area and thicker paint generally in the lighter area, but not necessarily impasto everywhere, right? It's just one of these variations. But certainly in the light area, there's a little bit more complexity which we will get into. It's not all going to be thick paint, but in the darker area, generally you never want thick paint because it's going to create reflections and it's going to create some problems that will make it difficult for you to create a realistic feeling. So when we pull this dark paint, notice it's going to remain consistent here on the palette. And that means that I've got enough loaded into my brush and that my brush is, properly tuned, let's say. It's tuned according to the color. It's not turning it into a mid-tone or something like that. And then I'm also pulling it in this direction. So notice this direction right here. This is going to be what I'll say is the darker direction, what we're going to do in the darker areas. So when I'm actually painting, I'm going to do it in that direction. This linen is going to have a particular reaction. So you'll notice that linen is really rough. But what I'm doing here is I'm kind of scratching on the surface. You see, like this? And that's what it's like to paint in the darker areas most of the time. You're going to kind of scratch into the surface and just allow those bristles to do some of the work. You're not going to be painting with big globs of paint or laying it down thick in the darker areas. The other thing is that you can go in particular directions, which I will cover more in the future, but notice I'm going in this direction now, and this is from the top left down to the bottom right. And the reason is that it's going to help prevent reflections. I can kind of knock down that paint if there's any thicker areas. We'll get into the importance of that with the brushwork and layering, but just so you know, that's what I'm doing, and there is a reason for it. So I'll show you why. Let's say if I take some of this black paint right here, and I pick this up heavy-handed like this, really thick, then I'm trying to put this down. You see that reflection? See how that's standing off the surface? The other thing is that it's not filling in the space because I didn't get the medium in there. So is this a disaster case? No, it's not terrible. It's okay, but watch what happens. If I knock this down and I pull this in that direction that I was just talking about, see how that fills in the space a lot more nicely? It's not going to be reflecting the light in the same way. So that is the key here with this application, and the reason you want to put it on relatively thin is that you don't want it to be reflecting a bunch of light and for that brush stroke to be visible. If you see that in a darker area, it's not going to make sense. It's not natural. It's not how we see the world. In darker areas, things are much more soft and subtle, and they don't have that kind of reflective glimmer compared to in lighter areas. It does actually contain a little bit of a reflection and a glossy feeling. So again, here's what you don't want to do with this black. You don't want to just pick up a large amount like that, just scoop it up like this, and then once you put this down, just put it down rough and leave all this texture to the surface, you see. See all that reflection? So the issue here is now we've got a lot of paint on the surface. There are some instances where you will want to have a lot of paint on the surface, not in a dark area, but in some other instances. And you may run into this issue. You may run into this issue where you've got too much paint on the surface, or perhaps your brush gets too filled with paint. And what you want to do here is, number one, remain calm. It's all going to be all right. Uncle Nick will take care of you. This right here is why we keep the palette knife handy. So you see these big globs of paint, especially in a dark area, that's an issue. And if you're trying to go back over this, maybe you have something with the paint that you don't like. Maybe this was more like an 8 value and you realize, oh no, I need to make this lighter. This actually should be a 6 value. Maybe there's something wrong with the paint too. Maybe you were looking for a different color entirely. If you try to go back over this repeatedly, you're just going to be making a muddy mess on the surface, and it's going to become increasingly difficult to actually fix that. So instead of trying to just brush and brush and brush and cover this thing up, what you actually need to do is get your good friend, the palette knife, and just scrape this off. So if we just scrape this off, see that? I can pick it up, and I can even put this back on my palette if I want. Then I'm going to clean the palette knife, so I'm going to wipe this off into my rag so that it's nice and fresh again. And I can even come back over this again and try to make sure I get any excess. So just like that, we've smoothed out the surface. We've given ourselves a surface that we can actually work on. We can paint back over this if we need to. So if you were unhappy and you needed to rework that for whatever reason, now you could do that. In this instance, let's say where, hypothetically panic ensues and you're dealing with this muddy brush covered in 20 layers of built up impasto, you need to first stop yourself, as I said, and then just come over here to your rag, try to get some of that off, and then what you can do is you can just dip back into your oil or your solvent, depending on how bad the situation is, and you just wipe this thing out, and that's going to help to free it up, and now you're ready for some fresh paint again, and you can go back working in a more soft manner, not having to worry about all that built up paint. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dip just a little bit more in here. Notice I'm, again, just kind of pulling off the edge so that way it's not overflowing with my medium. That's perhaps more so about mess prevention than it is really critical here, but if you were to take that and start putting it on your palette, if it's overflowing, you might find suddenly your palette is dripping and literally dropping that medium onto the ground. So same thing here again. I'm going to take this 9 value, scoop it up with my brush, and notice I pulled it through to make sure I've got a consistent mixture. Then I'm going to bring it over here and we're going to do the same thing. And you can practice as you go, see what the brush is like. If I put this down in different ways, what's it going to do? How's it going to interact with the surface? So here again, I just want to fill this in. We're not going to get too crazy with some of these techniques here today, but I'll put that down softly. If you want another kind of brush mark in your repertoire, what you can do is you can pick up a good amount of paint. If I need medium, I can get just a little bit, but I want to make sure I have enough paint here that I can pick it up. So I'm just going to repeatedly go over this to make sure I've got that nice consistent mixture. And then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this down directly. And so this is an important brush stroke to have for many different scenarios. You're just going to go like this. Whichever direction you're going, whether it's thin or thick with the brush as well, you're just going to take it and do one clean swoop, just like that. And if I still have some paint here, I can do another one, just like that. And if I run out, it's no problem. I'll just refill on the palette. So again, just pulling through here, making sure I have a good loaded brush. And what that means, a loaded brush means we have paint in the bristles. It's nice and filled with paint, but it's not overflowing. There's not a giant glob of paint hanging off the end. You notice I can still see some of those bristles. I can see that I have a good mixture here. It's not an inconsistent mixture. And I actually have paint there. So in the other direction, if I didn't have enough paint, I'd be pulling the palette dry and I wouldn't be left with any paint in the brush. Okay, so combining our knowledge here, there's what we were doing earlier, which is indirect painting. That's where you're just pushing the brush into the surface, kind of softly scratching on the surface and coloring that area. There's direct painting, and that's where you're just picking up the paint and you're putting it down so that it appears opaque and exactly as it's kind of created. And we can kind of combine here to think about the direction of the brush together with the direct painting application. So I'm going to go in this diagonal direction that I was describing, but I'm going to do it in one swoop, just like this. Okay, and I can fill in up here as well, just like that. And I use the other side of the brush to be clear. The key with direct painting is that you want to put the brush stroke down and then just leave it there and not go back over it. However, you know, we got this kind of reflective light, which you can see here, and therefore I want to break that up so that it's not showing all this reflective light. And our options are to either knock this down with the brush or to go over it with the palette knife. In this instance, I want to just go over it with the brush, so I'm just going to pull this into my kind of desired direction, which is not reflective. A little warning for you is that if you do this when you're painting, it's usually problematic. You don't want to do that very much. You can get away with it a little bit in the shadows, but oftentimes that's going to lead to a very weak or softer approach, and it's not going to create the sort of boldness that we're looking for. It will break up too much of your paint most of the time. So, you know, take this with a grain of salt. I am showing the values here, and we're going to learn as we go. And here is our 7 value. So again, I'm going to pull into this, just like we've been doing. Now when I put this down, I'm going to go in one direction, and I'm just going to leave the mark. So I'm going to put this down just like this, and I'll leave it there. At any point, I can just dip back into this oil if I decide I want to clean out that brush a little bit. And now I've got a fresher mixture for the next value. So now we're looking at the 6 value here, and part of the kind of issue right now is that there's not really enough paint for the amount of surface area that I'm covering. So this should be a smaller surface area probably. But I want to show you what you can do with direct painting. So I want to pull into this and make sure I'm getting a good amount of paint on my brush, and I'm paying particular attention to one side. So especially on one side, just like this. When I put this down, I'm just going to go in one kind of sideways mark, just like that. So that's what direct painting really should look like, is that you have a good amount of paint, and I'm picking up more paint again. I'm just going to go like this. So this is excellent practice if you're trying to really do this thing to the best of your abilities. Make sure you've got plenty of paint mixed up. And this is kind of this mid-tone range, so we can start to use just a little bit more paint. Now we're getting into the mid-tones, and this is where a lot of times when you're painting, you're going to want to be fairly direct. You might want to leave some painterly marks, and we're going to look at how to do that. So first, I'm going to clean out my brush again. Now when I pick this up, again, I'm going to scoop this up. It's only on one side. It's only on one side of the brush. So I'm just going like this, making sure I get this thing pretty well loaded. Not really impasto yet, but I'm gonna get a solid mark. So when I put this down, I'm gonna be pulling with my mark. I'm gonna try to be kind of fluid with it. So I'm just gonna mark, and maybe we want to create a line. We want to create something that's going to reflect sort of the shape. And so then I can just go like this. I know that might not look like much, but when you're actually painting, if that's on top of something and there's a little bit of contrast between them, that's how you create that sort of painterly effect. You create something where you have this brush mark and it feels very fluid. So practice that as you're filling in these values. Try to experiment just a little bit and see, you know, what does it feel like to apply that paint in some different ways? What does it look like? And how can you create some different effects in these areas? For example, I could get a little bit more paint on my brush here, just like this, and get it a little bit heavier on the tip of the brush. And then when I put this down, I can use the sharper side of the brush and just put down a sharp line like that. Another thing I'll point out is look at how there's an extreme difference in terms of the reflection here. So if I pull up a good amount of paint and I give myself something here which has, you know, a little bit of impasto, then I can put this down in this diagonal direction, just like this, and look at the reflective quality of that paint. If I compare that to, say, just pulling it down like this, there's a pretty drastic difference in terms of the amount of light. You see how this really stands out. So that's essentially the purpose of impasto. And just to show you something here, another technique, once you start to get into especially these lighter areas, with your brush loaded, you can kind of tap on the surface. And this can offer some texture so that you create a slight bit of a reflective quality, and also you're creating a blending through the layers. So if you have, let's say, a darker paint or a different color underneath this, we can tap on the surface like this in order to create a scumbling effect and just subtly build on top of that existing layer. So I'll fill in the rest of this space. I'm going to knock this down. I don't want impasto in this area. This value scale is coming along quite nicely, so at some point here, you know, after you've filled in a couple, it's good to take a step back. So that's a really important tip for you, is to take some distance, step back, get a good 5 to 10 feet away, and just look at it, see if there's anything that really stands out immediately, if anything looks like it needs to be changed, and that will offer you a new perspective. So it's a lot easier to see these major issues from a distance. And that is a very important tip which I will give to you guys that is going to be critical once we start to actually paint. Moving on, now we're into the lighter side. We're at the 4 value now, which, you know, you could consider a mid-tone perhaps, but it's on the lighter half of the palette for sure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch brushes now. I'm going to use a bigger brush. So you see this is quite a bit bigger, and this is my lighter brush. So if you notice the difference in terms of color between these, this one is quite a bit lighter. That's my lighter brush. And when I'm painting, I've always got at least a few different brushes, so that way I have something for the lights, for the darker values, and perhaps even a couple for the midtones. So with the lighter brush, I'm going to do the same thing here. Dip into my oil, and let's wipe this off. And in this area, you could use a little bit of oil. So I'll show you what that might look like. I'll just get some oil here. I'm actually not going to wipe it on the jar just because I want to make sure it's decently clean for the sake of the demo. And here's the 4 value. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this with this oil, and I'm going to give myself a really solid mixture here. And this is going to be much more fluid. So because I've got a little bit of that oil in there, once I put this down, it should be easier to really make a swift mark. And let's see what this looks like. So like that, for example. Now that looks a little bit too light to me. I think some of this oil and the kind of paint that was already in this brush perhaps impacted my mark there. There's no need to panic, but what I'll do is I'll actually move on to the next value. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but I want to fill in some of this space, and then I can come back and see what that looks like after I've got, you know, some of these surrounding values, because we have something happening here which is relative contrast. When you have only these darker colors here and we have this black background, the only thing that's contrasting with this is all of this dark value surrounding it. But if we add some lighter values, it might impact the way that we see it. I think I still will have to come back because this just looks like it might have been changed a little bit too much from my oil, but it's worth a shot. So here I'll put down a direct mark again. I'll just go straight like this. And then I want to show you what it looks like to add some more impasto to this. So this is the 3 value, to be clear. Not that that's important for the sake of what I'm about to do, but I'm going to scrape up as much of this as I can to give myself a more consolidated little pile here. That way it's easier to pick up with my brush. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press more into this palette. I'm going to kind of press as I scoop this up to make sure I'm getting all that picked up onto the brush. So you can see what that looks like. I've got, you know, a pretty decent amount there on the end of my brush. Okay, and then the key here with impasto is we also want to lay it down kind of heavy. So we're going to kind of press it into the surface and allow this to stand off of the surface. And at the same time, I can also consider the direction of my brush. So if I pull again, going from top right down to the bottom left, that can create a greater reflection. So you see it like that, how that's very reflective up here. Not quite as reflective down here, but I'll show you for the sake of contrast. If I pull sideways, just like this, you can see now it's a greater separation. So that reflection actually enhances this kind of glowing quality. It makes it feel like there's more light, and it is actually reflecting light. So I'll just go ahead and kind of knock this down, so that way we've got a smoother appearance. I will also point out, notice how much easier it is to fill in the space with this bigger brush. Got the 2 value here, and again I'll show you just what some of these techniques kind of look like. If I want to put this down in a very bold fashion, I can scoop up a really good amount of that paint, and then when I put this down, I can just put it down in a singular mark, just like that. There's a couple of interesting things here as well when it comes to the material and the surface quality. So you'll notice there's kind of some roughness here. You see these little circles in there, and that is actually because of the texture of the linen. So that's that rough texture that I was talking about. Together with some oil ground, that balances out really nicely, and you get a really fantastic effect when you're painting, especially on a bigger scale, where this is going to kind of add to the liveliness. It almost creates like a feeling of static or atmosphere, because these little dots are just throughout the surface creating texture, and it adds to this illusion that there is, you know, more going on. The other thing I'll point out is that you'll notice kind of these rough edges. So this is how it works with the hog hair bristle brushes. They create these fantastic little kind of scrapes, and it goes in an uneven way. So might be a little bit hard to see, but this right here, this kind of claw feeling that is dragging, that is really fantastic. When you're working on actual paintings, that can really help to enhance the sense of liveliness down to the most minute scale. I mean, literally embedded into every single brush stroke. So enough said about that. I will cover the rest of this up, and I just want to pick up some of this again, and I will, just put this down directly. So that's what it looks like if you're just going direct sideways. And I can show you what it looks like also if we were to use some impasto here. I could choose if I wanted to kind of tap it. You see how that creates a little bit of texture? Or the other thing I could do, if I scrape up some more paint right here, I can go like this, and this is how I would create a highlight, like that. So really laying it on thick. And you see how that gets a kind of sense of glow. And so that's one of the really cool things you can do in the lighter areas to add more texture, more luminosity, make it feel like, you know, it's more than just a photo or something two-dimensional. There is an actual three-dimensionality to it, and that is very literally on the surface. You're sculpting with the paint when you add the impasto. So I'll just paint this out just for our value scale, but that'll give you an idea about some of those things you can do with the lighter values. And the same goes for the white. I can pick this up pretty thick like this, and depending on how I actually put this onto the surface, it will impact the way that it appears. So if I put it on really thick like this and I kind of press into the surface, you can see how that adds some texture and it really stands up compared to if I just put it down directly like that, or if I clean out my brush a little bit here. I also don't have to use so much paint, and I could just put it down more thin, just like this. So you can see how much of a difference that makes. And I will go ahead and add some of this impasto just so you guys remember, and so it's exemplary here. But this is really like your lightest light, is when you're using your one value together with impasto. We can kind of break the surface right here just so it's not standing out so much. Now it's pretty much all filled in. It's just that 4 value, which I will go back over here, and I do indeed think it was just a little bit too light. So I'm going to clean my brush. I'm also going to use my palette knife here, and I cleaned off my palette knife. I'm just going to pull a little bit of this 5 value in there. I'll just pull a little bit of that to make it just a little bit darker, and we'll see what this looks like. I need to wipe out my brush even better. I'm not sure that made a whole lot of a difference. You can try and go even just a little bit darker. And something you can do also is you can kind of just tap this right on there, or you can use your finger if you're not afraid to touch the paint. You can just tap a little bit on there and see what that looks like. So I would say that's pretty satisfactory if you wanted to, and there's an issue going on here. You know, maybe not satisfied with that still, but I've kind of reworked it a bit. Then in order to continue reworking that, you would really need to go over this and scrape it off with your palette knife, and that way you're not going to have this issue of too much muddy paint. So fair warning, you don't want to have too much paint there, or that can cause some issues. The other thing I'll do here is I'll get some more of my 5 value. You see this here. And so I just want to clean this up just a little bit. Oh, I see what's going on. I see what's going on. This was bothering me right here, but I see now. It's because the linen is a little bit bent. It was folded right there, so there's like a crease in it. So that's why it has a little bit of an odd shape right there, but yeah, I see that's from the linen, so not really anything to do about that. I'm fairly satisfied with how this turned out. I think there is pretty good gradation here. This little dent is the only thing that bothers me, but I can't really fix that, so I'll just have to live with it. But if you were to find anything very unusual or that you don't like, then feel free to take your time and go back to the palette and then mix it up and try again and try to get a better segment or a better separation, whatever you're looking for. But that pretty much wraps it up here. So I'll show you one final thing, which is cleaning off the palette and kind of shutting down the studio, so to speak. What you want to do after you're done painting, and feel free if you're still painting or whatever, feel free obviously to continue onwards and keep this palette, maybe even use this palette for making a sphere painting perhaps. But once you're done for the day and you've decided, okay, it's time to shut down the studio, then you want to get your palette knife and clean off this palette. I'm just going to take all this paint and I'm going to put it over here on this side, somewhere where I'm not really actively using my palette. All I'm doing here is just scraping down to the surface just to make sure this is pretty smooth, and that way in the future when I go to work with this, I'm not going to have to deal with these kind of uneven bumps or edges or anything like that. You definitely don't want this to dry into your palette. So if it dries into your palette, you're going to get some very rough edges here, and it's not going to be fun to work with. So that's crucial. That's something I do every day, and even if I kind of think I'm not going to be coming back, maybe I'll come back, maybe not, then just go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and scrape it off, because otherwise, yeah, when you come back and it's all dried and crusty, that's no fun. The next thing then, of course, is to clean off the palette knife, and I want to make sure I get all that paint off of here. Something else you could do, if you really want to save your paint, you could take this and you can put that into a jar, maybe a jar with some oil, something like that. You can create your own magic mud mixture. Then it's less wasteful and you can keep your palette nice and clean. Then the final step here is to just get these brushes, and if I have any thick impasto on here or anything like that, I can just wipe it off onto my rag, and then they're just going to go straight into the jar. And that's it. And now I'm, cleaned up. If I have to do anything in the space, then I would clean up the space, or something else I like to do is to set up for the next painting session. Because right now I'm already in the cleaning mood. I, did my stuff with the palette, put my brushes away, all that good stuff. I might as well keep that momentum and set up for tomorrow. That way, once I get here tomorrow, I don't have to do any work. I'm just ready to go. I'm ready to start painting, and then it's not, you know, another step of friction that might prevent me from actually painting. With all that being said, I hope this was helpful. I look forward to seeing your value scales. I will reiterate to just keep calm. You know, there's no rush here. You can spend hours on this if you want to. I've spent well over 2 hours now, I'm sure. And that's okay. That's, you know, part of the process here, and a very important part of learning how to paint is understanding how to mix your colors, how to prepare the palette. These are all of the things that are kind of boring in a sense, but they're so important for getting good results and actually being prepared for your work. Everybody thinks about painting as actually just putting paint on the surface, but really this preparation stage is equally, if not more important. With that, thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.